Right, thanking God once again as we move closer to the end of the book of Acts. Let's call Acts chapter 24. Felix, and maybe subtitle it Jaded, as we'll see Paul's first defense in Caesarea before the governor Felix, in a chapter that will begin in verses 1 and 2, saying that after 5 days, those who accuse Paul will arrive in Caesarea with Ananias, a familiar name, especially if he is the same Annas that goes all the way back to, as we mentioned in the sermon, the persecution or the trial of Christ. Either way, he's going to arrive this time with a representative, or some versions will literally say a lawyer by the name of Tertullus, who is going to begin in verses 2 through 8 to lay out their case against Paul. And we'll talk about it more in style as opposed to literal quotes from what's described as his address, as we mentioned in the sermon. I'm going to probably do a lot of what we did in the sermon in terms of summarizing what these various folks are going to say now in this hearing before Phoenix. But his style is going to use flattery in verses 2 through 3 to introduce himself to Felix, seeming to try to butter him up without a whole lot of substance. That's going to continue as in verses 4 through 5, he is going to project onto Paul the things that they have actually been doing, not only in Jerusalem, but throughout the regions where Paul has been preaching, starting riots in response to the things that he has been doing. He is going to actually charge Paul with starting a riot in Jerusalem at the temple. Even further, though, in verse 5, he is going to try to, what I would describe as, label Paul in the style of what we might call ad hominem attacks, or personal attacks that don't deal with the substance of a legal charge against Paul, seeming to, as we talked about in the sermon and other lessons, get a whole lot of mileage for a very little effort in presenting actual evidence. He is going to call Paul a plague and a ringleader in a way that, if it's effective, may potentially convince Felix to look at Paul from a perspective that just makes all the allegations stick, even without evidence. However, we'll see it's not going to work, because it's going to seem that Felix is experienced as a governor, listening to people dispute in front of him all the time. My ad lib. But Tertullus is going to go on, once again, lacking substance, shifting his responsibility to actually ask decent questions that would actually get from Paul admissions, or at least facts that support the allegations against him. He is simply going to dismiss that responsibility and seem to pass it off on Felix by simply saying, you'll be able to see as you question him that all the things we're charging him with are true. However, it's not necessarily going to be true, because in support of his case, like we said, instead of facts, he's going to have in verse 9 a large crowd that is simply going to kind of nod and endorse what he has said. However, one of the things we noticed is in that huge crowd, there didn't seem to be anyone qualified to actually be a witness or anything other than a simple yes man. Understanding that, in verses 10 through 21, it is now going to be Paul's turn to defend himself, and he's going to seem to take a very different style. And even though he is likewise going to show respect to Felix, his respect is going to take the shape of gratitude for the fact that Felix has legitimate insight into the people over whom he is governing. And based upon that insight, he is going to say in verse 11, you'll be able to verify that I didn't just get here. I've been here for a while. And so in verse 12, he's going to say, during that time, they have no allegations that I caused any kind of riot or disturbance whatsoever. More importantly, verse 13, he is going to say they have no proof for any of the additional charges that they have made against me. He will, however, go on to confess, verses 14 through 21, the rest of his address, saying that he is guilty of at least a couple of things, understanding that he is actually the same as his accusers, to the degree that they all agree that God is the one true God who gave them the law, and he agrees in the law that they essentially are accusing him under. Beyond that, he believes in the prophets, but where he differs is he believes in the resurrection, and the resurrection as the fulfillment of the prophecies that Jesus was actually the Christ. And so this is a doctrinal dispute as opposed to a legal dispute, understanding that the resurrection, as we mentioned before, is not the kind of dispute that would justify the death penalty. Why? Because half of them don't even believe in a resurrection. That's why they are the Sadducees, and it might not be half, but a large portion of them as Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection, and the other half, the Pharisees, do. Therefore, the resurrection question isn't enough to justify the death penalty. The thing that seems to upset them is the way in which he is reminding them of the Christ who they have tried to kill. And accordingly, the way that Paul is reminding them that the way is still growing, something that they have tried to end with the Christ and are now struggling to get control of. But beyond their dispute about the resurrection, the only charge they actually have against Paul, he is going to confess to, and that is the way in which he spoke harshly, or what might be considered to be evil, against the high priest, a violation of the law, but once again, one that does not justify death under the law. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have already said that. And based upon what Paul has confessed to and the fact that there don't seem to be a lot of facts justifying the allegations against him in verses 22 through 23, Felix is going to do what we would call today continue the hearing, essentially delaying his decision, but giving Paul liberty while he remains in custody. And even more than that, verses 24 through 27, the end of the chapter, we are going to see Felix and his wife send for Paul to hear more from him. And as Paul talks to them about the need for self-discipline or self-control in light of the coming judgment, he is going to speak persuasively enough that Felix is going to be alarmed, saying, "Go away, I'll call for you at a time when I have more opportunity." And as opposed to that simply being an idle or empty promise, he is actually going to call for Paul often, but he's going to seem to do it with mixed motives, because one of the things that he is hoping to get from Paul is a little bit of money to ease his decision to potentially release Paul. But Paul's not going to pay him, and in order to do a favor to the Hebrews who want him killed, he is at least going to keep him in custody, passing it off to the next one to take over for him, that being Festus, as we'll see in the next chapter. But this chapter reminded me most of what I've chosen to subtitle the chapter, and that is jaded. And the whole concept of becoming jaded usually takes on maybe a more pessimistic tone when you look at it from the perspective that becoming jaded in a lot of ways is the thing that can happen to us when we've seen so much dishonesty, negativity, or the uglier sides of human character that we begin to set low expectations from others. However, there is another side to becoming jaded that helps us to basically have our, sometimes the saying goes, our hope or our faith in humanity restored when we see someone who actually gives us reason to raise our expectations beyond where we might have lowered them, understanding all of the things that we might have seen in life. And Felix is one who sees a lot of people, presumably if he has a lot of cases like this that come before him as a governor, sees a lot of disputes, probably sees a lot of people who are deeply self-interested, always twisting things from their perspective to try to persuade him, as if he hasn't seen a whole lot of other people before them doing the exact same thing. And as they have hired Tertullus, he's experienced, but his experience might have likewise jaded him to believe that spinning facts or twisting the truth to his own perspective might be the most effective way to go, when what Paul is doing in contrast might actually be that kind of thing that can restore our faith in humanity. Understanding that Festus, if he is an experienced governor, as Paul gives him credit for being, a man of insight, he is going to be able over time, if he's a wise man, to possibly, even if not perfectly, sort out fact from fiction by identifying some potential patterns in those who would like to replace facts and basic truth with spin, creativity, clever sounding, whatever the kinds of things that might cause him to begin to tune out the patterns and the arguments over time. But Paul, in keeping it simple, sticking to the facts, reminds me of a couple of things we were taught in the practice. One of those is just a simple rule of evidence called the best evidence rule, meaning the best evidence of a thing is actually the thing itself, or with regard to documents, the best evidence of a document is the original, not a copy of it, not a description of it, not hearsay or chatter about it. It's actually the thing. And so to the degree that they are accusing him of something specific, but they're talking around the issue and labeling him and doing this and this and that and projecting, he might have seen that before. And he realizes that if you've got facts, you just go to the facts. Paul, on the other hand, does just that. After thanking Felix, for his insight, challenges them. If you got facts, where are the facts? If you've got witnesses, where are the witnesses? And it's a simple approach that is thousands of years old. And it seems to be just as persuasive to Felix that it can be to wise judges or those who have to sort out fact from fiction today, which may explain why in seeing Paul's direct approach, understanding a different principle that we have from the law that doesn't necessarily cite a law as much as a tactic, meaning if you've got strong facts, you argue the facts. If you don't have strong facts, you tend to look for other means of persuasion. Sometimes if you at least got the equities or what we call justice on your side, if you don't have facts, you go to justice. But if you don't have the facts and you don't really have a just cause, that's when you start seeing the ad hominems, the spin, and all that. And so understanding that, seeing Paul's direct approach, it is not necessarily a surprise that Felix continues his case, effectively delaying a ruling, and in his personal time, as we noticed, chooses to use his personal time to hear Paul out more, and not just hearing Paul out personally. He brings his wife in because she's Hebrew as well to hear Paul. And so when they're taking their personal time aside to hear from this prisoner, it probably gives you an indication of the impression that Paul left with his direct approach when Felix just needed to hear facts. And that helps us to understand as well, even though it can be tempting to engage in all kinds of debate tactics. At the end of the day, there are those who have become jaded with hearing spin and clever sounding arguments, and whether they know it or not, are just craving to hear straight up truth. And so as we see with Paul, God willing, it can be encouragement for us that even though we exist in a world that more and more seems to be gravitating towards spin and things that sound clever, there is still value in the straight up truth. And so as we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that in a world that is growing more and more jaded, my prayer is that God can help restore our confidence in the truth so that we do not become so jaded on the truth that we eventually lose our ability to tell it effectively.